wonderful to see you all here this evening. Welcome to the forum at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. My name is David King. I'm an assistant professor at the Kennedy School. The faculty of PAL 201, which is Elective and Advocacy Politics, would like to welcome all of you and our students and all of the guests here this evening. Our guests this evening are Professor Robert Putnam, whom I'll introduce in a moment, and the Reverend Charles Stith, I'll also introduce after Professor Putnam talks. I'll leave it up to Bob Putnam to explain the meaning behind the intriguing title, which is Bowling Alone. But what you need to know is that generally what we're talking about tonight is community and the decline of community in the U.S. The idea of community in the U.S. and American culture is rich, and it exists at the same time that we have a great idea of the icon of rugged individualism in the U.S. So you have Gary Cooper at high noon as the rugged individual. And furthermore, there's this tension between rugged individualism and communitarianism in the context of capitalism. Professor Putnam's going to argue that social capital, which is made up of the networks that connect all of us as individuals, social capital is important to have successful economies, but more importantly, it's critical to have successful democracies. Many of you here are familiar with Thomas Hobbes' quip about the state of human nature. He says that without governments, humans would be destined to a world, born into a world which is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's the world of rugged individualism on one extreme that we would worry about. But Hobbes was wrong about something fundamental. We're not born into a world of individuals and individualism. We're born into families with mothers and fathers and grandparents. We're born into communities, and it's important to maintain those fabrics of communities in governments, in societies, for everything to work as best they can. Communities are natural. Rugged individualism is an aspect that has to exist in communities. We often hear this phrase that good fences make good neighbors. And I read about that in an article describing Bob Putnam's work, sort of as something to hold up against, or an argument against, the idea of social capital. But don't forget how Robert Frost's poem begins, Mending Wall. I'll read the first few lines of it here for you. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps, even two can pass abreast. And the poem goes on to describe how nature abhors a wall, and it's humans in their vanity and their desire to be alone does what's unnatural. Well, Bob Putnam's going to talk today about how walls get in the way of good communities and good democracies. For many of you, Bob Putnam is an old friend, because Bob Putnam was the dean of the Kennedy School for 2 years. He was dean when the slot that I was eventually hired to fill was opened up, so I'm particularly happy to be here tonight and honor him. His background is of two sorts. He's been educated at Swarthmore and Oxford and Yale. He has a PhD in political science from Yale, taught for years at the University of Michigan, joined Harvard in 1979. At the same time, he has a background in small Midwestern town. And you'll hear elements of both of those in the discussion today. He's the author or editor of 7 books, over 30 articles, and he's the author of an important work that many of you in this room have read, Making Democracy Work. The Economist called this a great work of social science, worthy to rank alongside de Tocqueville, Pareto, and Weber. I think that's probably hyperbole to most of us that know him as Bob. We don't think of him necessarily as de Tocqueville, Pareto, or Weber. Because Bob is familiar to all of us, and within an hour, Bob will be familiar to you, and he'll give you a message that's down to earth, and I hope you all welcome him warmly. I'll just leave that there.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be back here in this special space, in this special school. I'd like to begin, if I can, by telling you a little bit about how I came to be one of the country's leading experts on bowling. Several years ago, some time ago actually, more than a few years ago, I was interested in the question, which is relevant in this place: why are some places better governed than others? And I happened to be in Italy at a time when the Italians, in effect, created a natural experiment with which we could try to answer that question. A new set of governments was created all across Italy. All of these governments had the same form. On paper, they looked identical. But the contexts into which these new regional governments were introduced were very different. And so, by following these governments over 20, 25 years, we examined which of the governments were successful and which of them were failures. Some of them were very successful. I don't know what all states you come from, but all of us live here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I can tell you that some of these regions in Italy are better governed than the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, hard as that will be to believe. And on the other hand, some of these regional governments were awful, or utter corrupt failures. So the question that we asked was, how come? It was as if we had taken genetically identical seeds and planted them in different pots of soil and watered them differently so we could see whether there was some secret element in the soil that explained why some of these governments flourished and others faded and failed. And we had a lot of different ideas when we began this research about what might be the secret ingredient that explained good government. We thought maybe education was the secret ingredient. That would be a natural thing for an educator to think of. We thought maybe wealth would be what counted, or the character of the political party system, or well, we had lots of different ideas. Mean temperature at noon seemed like it was a possible explanatory variable, but it turned out unexpectedly to us that the right answer, the thing that best explained why some places had good government and other places didn't, was choral societies and football clubs. Some places had dense networks of civic engagement. People in those places voted more, but they didn't just vote more, they were engaged with one another in lots of civic organizations, choral societies and football clubs and reading groups and Rotary clubs and so on. And government in those places worked. And other places didn't have that dense network of civic engagement, and government in those places failed. Now it turned out that in the places where there was successful government and where people were engaged in choral societies and football clubs, there was also a relatively higher level of economic development. And for a long time, we thought that was because wealth produced choral societies. By that I mean, if you're poor and sickly and a peasant, you don't have time to go sing in the evening. So wealth produced choral societies, and then we thought maybe choral societies, or possibly wealth itself, produced good government. But it turned out, when we looked more carefully at the history of these regions, that we had it exactly backwards. It wasn't that wealth produced choral societies. It was that choral societies produced wealth. Two regions that 100 years ago had been equally backward, but one of them happened to have had a lot more civic engagement, a lot more choral societies. That region didn't begin wealthier, but it's gotten wealthier and wealthier and wealthier over the last 100 years. Now I want to introduce here one bit of social science jargon. I promise it's the only bit that I'll introduce, and I promise also that it will be helpful in our later discussion. The term I want to introduce is social capital. You all know what physical capital is. Physical capital is some physical object, a screwdriver. You save up your pennies, you buy a screwdriver, and you can be more productive than you would be if you didn't have that screwdriver. That's physical capital. About 25 years ago, economists began talking about human capital. By human capital, they were trying to draw an analogy between a screwdriver and a Harvard degree. Hard as that is to believe, they said that there were things about getting an education that were like investing in a screwdriver. That is, you could save up your money, get an education, a university education, or a job, a training in an automobile school or something, automobile mechanic school, and you would be more productive. The same you would be more productive than you would be if you didn't have that education. So, physical capital, human capital. Now some of us are calling attention to the fact that there are features of our social context which also can make us more productive. The same you, in one setting with a high level of civic engagement, with a high level of social trust and reciprocity, where people will do favors for one another, not in the hope of immediate return, but just because that's the way people live in this community, you in that community can be more productive than you would be in a different community that had less social capital. So that's what I mean by social capital, and therefore I can summarize the findings of our research in Italy by saying social capital dense networks of civic engagement explain not only why some places are better governed than others, but also why some places have had more economic success than others. Okay, that's the kind of preface to the story I want to tell tonight, because as I was finishing that work in Italy, I began wondering about whether there was any connection between social capital and what I was really concerned about. As a citizen, I have been concerned, and here at the Kennedy School, many of us have been concerned, about the sense that our system was faltering. The irony at this very moment in which geopolitically and ideologically liberal democracy had swept the battlefield, a growing sense here at home that this experiment in self-government was faltering. And so I began asking myself, is there some connection between this thing that I'm concerned about as a citizen and what I've been studying about as an academic, as a scholar, that is social capital? And it seemed to me that the way to address that question was to see what had been happening to social capital, what had been happening to civic engagement and social connectedness in the United States over the last generation. Now, some of what I've discovered will be familiar to all of you. All of you will know that voting is down roughly 25% over the last 30 years. It'll turn out that that's actually one of the less important and less dramatic changes in social capital. We are going to the ballot place less frequently than our parents did. But let's move. I'm going to actually walk away from this because I feel a little more comfortable not being behind the podium. Because I now want to talk a little bit about civic engagement. Every year, every month for the last 25 years, the Roper organization has been asking people, have you at all ever in the last year been to some meeting where there was discussion of school or community affairs? Have you been to any meeting in the last year where people have talked about, town or school affairs? The number of us who say yes has declined by 40% over this last 25 years. So we're voting less, we're talking about public affairs less. Many other indicators of political engagement show the same kind of downward trend. Basically, I'm going to be throwing at you a variety of statistics, mostly over the last 20 or 25, 30 years. In effect, over my adult lifetime, I confess to you that it has occurred to me that maybe in some sense I'm the independent variable here, that it's ever since I got involved in, ever since I came of age politically, that the country's been going to hell in a handbasket. Well, okay, we're voting less, we're talking about shared community concerns less, but it's by no means only in that domain that we're connected with one another less. It's convenient here to look at measures of engagement in formal organizations. And the place to begin there, perhaps, is with religious organizations. As a rough rule of thumb in the United States, half of all social activity in America is religious. Half of all volunteer time is religious, half of all philanthropy is religious, half of all organizational memberships are religious. So it makes a difference what changes have been going on in our patterns of religious behavior. There's a little bit of disagreement about this because not all of the statistical series give exactly the same answer to the question, but roughly speaking, there's been about a 20% decline, maybe a little bit more if you believe some of the trends, in church attendance over the last 30 years. And it's not only that we're going to church services less. Actually, I have to report to you that there's recently been some research by sociologists in which they've checked up the answers to public opinion polls. They've asked people, did you go to church last week? And then they've gone to look in the pew to see whether you actually were there. And I have two disturbing bits of evidence to report to you. First of all, we fib a lot when we're asked that question. In fact, over-reporting, about twice as many of us say we went to church last week as did. And even worse, we're fibbing more than our parents did. So that the public opinion polls on did you go to church last week tend to underestimate, the decline. The decline is actually worse than we're confessing it is in terms of attending religious services. And it's not only religious services, it's attending all those other sorts of groups that are clustered around churches, Bible study groups and Sunday schools and Haverot and all of the various organizations that people have been engaged in around religious services. So we're voting less, we're talking about politics less, we're going to church less. a generation ago, the most common, or certainly one of the most common kinds of social affiliation for people in the working class, especially men in the working class, was trade unions. Union membership, as many of you will know, is off by 60% over this same period, the last 4 decades. It's not only those kinds of associations. There are many, many different kinds of associations in which we are less engaged now civically than we were once, or than our parents were. A particularly important kind of example is the PTA. I'll get to it later, to a reason why I think that is an important example, but membership in the PTA is off by 50% over this period, 50%. That's taking into account the number of kids. It's not just there are fewer kids, it's that half as many parents belong to the PTA as did a generation ago. It's true as well for various men's clubs and women's clubs, what I have come to call animal clubs. I call them that because I've only as I began to do the work did I discover that all men's organizations are named for animals. The Lions Club and the Moose Club and the Elks Club and the Eagles Club and so on. Well, the animal clubs and Masons and Shriners and so on, all of those organizations are down by about 20, 25, some of them down by 30, 40, 50% over this same period. Now you will think, maybe that you'll think that's because those organizations are kind of vague 19th century outmoded ideas. That isn't quite true. For most of this century, the proportion of American men who belonged to organizations of that sort grew. There were more American men of the relevant age group in the animal clubs in the 70s than had been true in the 60s, and more in the 60s than in the 50s, and more in the 50s than in the 40s. For most of this century, the proportions are rising, and then suddenly, silently, puzzlingly, inexplicably, those trends began to level off and then to decline. And the trends for traditional women's organizations, the League of Women Voters, for example, or women's clubs of various sorts, show basically the same trend. The downturn comes about 10 years earlier. For women's organizations, it comes in the early to middle 60s, whereas for men's organizations, the leveling off and then downturn begins in the early 70s. A large number of various kinds of civic organizations show the same puzzling trend. It's not only it is do-gooding that's down. Volunteering for the Red Cross, for example. Well, listen. You've got to understand, in each of these organizations, the people running the organization think that it's something that they did. They know their numbers are down. They don't know everybody else's numbers are down. So every organization I've discovered is a little uneasy about sharing these numbers with outsiders. I have the following bit of information only on the understanding that I won't share it widely publicly, but as I look around the room, I can see this is a trustworthy group. So if you will all agree to share with me this, volunteering for the Red Cross is off by 50% over this period. Volunteering for the Boy Scouts, adult volunteers for the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are off the same order of magnitude. It's not only do-gooding organizations, however, that are off, and that's why I use this really crazy title, Bowling Alone. Bowling in leagues, bowling in teams is way down. Now I can tell you that didn't, as I hoped it would, knock your socks off. That's because you don't fully appreciate the importance of bowling in our society. Bowling is very common. This year more Americans will bowl than will vote. Bowling is big in America. And bowling is increasing in importance. Number of people who bowl has gone up by about 10-15% over the last decade or so. So more of us than ever before are bowling. But bowling in leagues, bowling in teams is down by 40%. So we're bowling more, but bowling alone. Now you may wonder, how in the world do I know a crazy fact like that? The answer is that I was the owner of one of the largest chains of bowling lanes heard I was doing this work and came to me to talk about his problem. Bowling lane owners, it turns out, are very concerned about bowling alone, because if you bowl in a league, you drink 4 times as much beer and you eat 4 times as many pretzels. And the money in bowling is in the beer and pretzels. It's not in the balls and shoes. They're concerned about the fact that we're bowling alone because of the bottom line. I'm concerned about the fact we're bowling alone for a different reason. In order to explain this, I have to ask, how many of you have ever bowled? Good, good. More than would have answered if I'd said voted. And how many of you bowl in a league? See? Okay, is there anybody in the room who has bowled in a league, ever? Great, okay, well you'll have to check me, we'll have to explain to the rest of them why it matters that people are not bowling in leagues. If you bowl alone, you sort of throw the ball down all of you know that, you throw the ball down the lane. If you bowl in a league, there are 5 people on a team, 2 teams, 10 people. At any given moment, 2 of the 10 are standing up at the lanes, ready to throw the balls down the lane, and the other 8 are sitting in a semicircle. And you always probably wondered if you were bowling alone why there were those semicircles at the backs of the lanes, and that's for when you used to have teams. People sat there, and they would sit there, kind of drinking their beer and eating their pretzels and talking. Now, most of the time, of course, they're talking about whether O.J. did it and what the latest soap opera they saw was, but occasionally they were talking about the bond issue or other issues of civic concern. And the reason that I want to emphasize that it's not just do-gooding organizations, but even things as mundane as bowling leagues, in which we're increasingly disconnected from one another, is that that's yet another missing occasion in which we no longer can have a regular conversation with people that we know well about shared concerns. It's easy. We have lots of conversations with one another. I sat, and these conversations, in fact, are made easier by modern technology. I sat next to somebody on the airplane yesterday on the shuttle, and just as a test, I said to the person, "What do you think was in the envelope?" Right, I can tell who here has been watching the O.J. trial. For most Americans who've been watching the O.J. trial, if you can say to them, "What do you think was in the envelope?" and they know what you mean. So we have this kind of anonymous conversations are facilitated in contemporary America by mass media. But those anonymous conversations, whether it's with your anonymous seat partner on the shuttle, or whether it's with Ted in Toledo who calls up and says, "Hi, I'm Ted in Toledo," and then gives his opinion, those are not, in some deep philosophical sense, responsible conversations. We don't take, in an anonymous conversation, we don't take responsibility for our views. We don't know how to interpret other people's views in the same way that we do if we're having a conversation with a bowling league partner whom we see every week. And so what I'm talking about in part is that as we become disconnected from one another, we have less occasion for what philosophers call deliberative democracy. That is, occasions to have serious conversations with people we know well and know how to trust and know what to make of what they say. Well, we're not bowling, we're not voting, we're going to church less, we're less often in union halls and so on. It's, by the way, not only formal organizations in which we're less well connected, even in informal ways we're less well connected with one another. We know our neighbors less well than our parents did. The pollsters have asked Americans, how often do you spend a social evening with your neighbor? And the number of Americans who say, never, I never spent a social evening with a neighbor, has doubled over this same period of time. Now, it's not true that every single organization in America has fewer members. Some organizations have had explosive growth. Indeed, one that I happen to belong to, is the largest private organization in the world. It's had explosive growth. It's grown from 300,000 to 33 million over the last 30 years. Right, it's the American Association of Retired People. Now, I belong to the AARP, as maybe one or two other people in the room know, because when you turn 50 in this country, the AARP sends you a membership card in the mail. And I thought, well, what the heck, maybe I can get a discount on motels or something. So, and my total membership activity each year, when I'm really a full-time member in the AARP, it takes me 35 seconds. That's the amount of time I've checked this, that it takes to write the check for $12. Check writing organizations, or mailing list organizations, that is, organizations in which membership means writing a check, are rising. What's characteristic, however, of those sorts of organizations, whether it's the Sierra Club or the AARP or whatever, is you don't know any other member. Or at least you don't know that you know any other member. I mean, actuarially, I know that since there are 33 million of us AARPers in the country, there must be at least one or two other members here, but I wouldn't know it because we never meet. If another member of my bowling team were in the room, I would know that, because you know. So that's what's missing. These are these organizations that are, in which membership means writing a check, are growing. Organizations in which membership means being there are declining in membership. So we're less connected with one another in a variety of ways, formal and informal, and probably as a result of that, we trust one another less. According to public opinion polls that have asked the same question in an identical form over the last almost 50 years, 30 years ago, if you ask most Americans trusted one another. Now, most Americans don't trust one another. And that's part of the same general decline of civic engagement and social connectedness, or what I call social capital. Well, I want to address now only 3 questions, and I'll try to do it briefly because I want to make sure we have time for Reverend Stith and then for some questions and answers. 3 simple questions. One is, does it matter? The second is, why? Why did this happen? And the third is, what can be done about it? Well, does it matter? It matters actually in a lot of ways. And the main thing I want to persuade you of is that this is not just a matter of warm, cuddly feelings or the absence of warm, cuddly feelings. In a lot of practical, measurable ways, the kind of things that MPPs know how to measure are affected by this decline of social capital. Let me give some examples. There are lots of examples, and I could go on all night. I'll try to be selective and brief. Take schools. Suppose you cared about the quality of your schools, your local schools. You might have two different strategies. You might increase by 10 or 20% the amount of money you were investing in public schools, paying teachers more salaries or buying better books or whatever. Or you could increase by 10%, 20% the number of parents who were belonging to the PTA. Most of the evidence says that the second is a more effective strategy for improving the quality of your schools. And conversely, the fact that our parents are no longer engaged with their children's schools is part of the reason for why they don't work so well. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we shouldn't be spending money on our schools. Indeed, my wife, who's here someplace tonight, is a public school teacher, and I have an economic interest in the fact that we should pay our public schools teachers a good salary. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have government. I am saying, however, that the erosion of social capital has real consequences, makes life more difficult, and in fact makes the job of teachers more difficult. Take crime, for example. Again, same strategy. You could have two strategies for addressing questions of crime. You could increase by 10% the number of cops on the beat, or you could increase by 10% the number of neighbors who know one another's first name. The evidence suggests the second is a pretty effective crime-fighting strategy, and yet the fact that we don't know our neighbors as well as we once did must be part of the reason why crime, at least crime among anonymous crime among strangers, seems to be causing greater and greater fear for our citizens. Now, of course, part of the reason we have greater crime is because we have less social capital, less civic engagement, but part of the reason that we have less neighboring is because of crime. That is, people are afraid to go out at night. So we have here a little vicious circle in which social problem means less social capital, means more social problem, means less social capital. And our society has lots of these little vicious circles in which things are getting worse in a kind of an endogenous process. Well, okay, I said endogenous just because I wanted to show that actually I did belong on the faculty of the Kennedy School. Crime, schools, health, jobs. Here's a really interesting study done actually in the central city of Boston, but the same principles apply elsewhere. Take two identical kids from the central city of Boston. They are identical in every measurable respect. The same age, the same gender, the same race, the same number of years of education. Their parents have the same number of years of education. They come from the same kind of family background. I mean by that they come from two-parent families, or they come from one-parent families. Their parents and grandparents have the same number of years of education. They go to school, they both go to church, or they both don't go to church, but at least we're controlling for that. We're controlling for everything about these kids individually. The only difference between them is that one kid lives on a block where other people go to church, and the other kid lives on a block where other people don't go to church. The kid who's fortunate enough to live on a block where other people go to church, statistically is substantially more likely to have a job, less likely to be on drugs, less likely to have a criminal record. This kid didn't do anything wrong, or at least didn't do anything wrong that this kid didn't do individually. This kid just has the misfortune to live on a block where there's a low degree of social capital, a low degree of civic engagement. Now, you may wonder, what's the mechanism? Why does church-goingness by neighbors have this effect? I can't exclude the possibility that it's God's grace that is the independent variable here, but the sociological mechanism through which God is working is pretty well understood. It is that most of us get our jobs through networks. I mean, that's even true for Harvard faculty, and it's true for most of us. We get our jobs through whom you know. If you're in an area where there's a low degree of social connectedness, where the social networks are scanty, you're less likely to run into somebody who says to you, "Did you hear that Baybanks is hiring?" So people who live in an area where there's an absence of social capital are less likely to benefit from the economic opportunities in the broader setting. And there may also be normative effects. Sociologists are now doing a lot of work on what are called neighborhood effects, that is, the effects of neighbors. Now notice that what this all means is that if you go to church, it may be good for you, it's also good for me. That is, I'm more likely to have a job if you go to church. Now, probably, you think of many things when you're deciding on Sunday morning whether to, get up or not to get up and go to church. You think about, your chances of salvation and so on. But I bet you weren't worrying about whether I was going to have a job. Which is another way of saying that social capital has lots of externalities. That's economist talk for saying that things that you do and that you make, decisions that you make, have consequences for other people. And in the area of externalities, often we underproduce these public goods, which is another way of saying that you're probably not taking into account the positive effects that your social capital production, going to church, for example, has for other people. And probably collectively we're underproducing social capital when we make decisions privately. There are a lot of examples. I'll just mention two more that I think are interesting about the effects of social capital. One comes from a study that's being done by the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. I learned about this because someone called me and told me about the research they were doing and came up to Cambridge to talk with me about the implications. A fascinating study on AIDS prevention programs. The Center for Disease Control has done a major study of how to try to control AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, in some target populations that are very hard to reach. They're disconnected from the rest of American society. Prostitutes, teenage runaway throwaways, partners of self-injecting drug users, gays not out of the closet. So across the country they've targeted some communities of this sort, and they've done elaborate controls in which for one set of these communities they have thrown the whole toolkit of modern public health education at that community. They've done peer counseling, and they've done radio spots and TV ads and storefronts and street corner leafleting and so on. All like trying to explain the dangers of AIDS and explain how to avoid it and so on. And then they check, did it make a difference? Did HIV infection rates go down? And did the incidence of safe sexual practices go up as people got the message? And the answer turns out to be, puzzlingly, that some places this program really works. It's hard to find programs that really work, but this one, some places, actually has reduced the HIV infection rate among these populations. But in other places, the program had no effect at all. So they were puzzling. How come our program works sometimes? We try this programmatic injection. It works some places and not others. And it turns out the answer is social capital, strangely enough. It turns out that sometimes these programmatic interventions, these external education programs and so on, came into communities where there was, in fact, already among the people in this community some social connections. I mean, for example, there were two groups of prostitutes in Houston divided only by an interstate, and on one side the program worked and on the other side of the interstate it didn't work. And where it worked, it turned out, was because the girls among themselves had a sense of connections and they passed information, and on the other side it was a much more isolated, atomized group, and the program, the message didn't take. Now the way the mechanism works, of course, if you think about it, is that if this message comes into a community where there is some sense of connections, you're more likely to hear about, get the message, and get it in trusting ways than you are in a community that lacks social capital. Last example that I want to mention, because I really want to convince you that you ought to go bowling more in leagues, is that bowling in leagues or being socially connected is really good for your health. Some fascinating studies done of the health effects of social connectedness. Controlling for everything you can imagine, controlling for blood chemistry and whether you jog or not, and your diet and your age and your gender and so on. Your risk of dying, well, your risk of dying actually is high. But I'm sorry. Your risk of dying in the next year is cut in half by joining one group. Your risk of dying is cut in a quarter by joining two groups. So it makes a difference to your own survival. Now, if you ask, well, how does that happen? How come connections have that effect, controlling for all these, the physiology and so on? There's a little bit of it that is causation in the reverse direction. That's cheating. That is, people who join groups probably are healthier to begin with. But the controlled studies say that actually isn't the main factor. Part of it may be actually physiological, that actually having contact with people does have beneficial effects physiologically. But part of it is that if you go to a group, or if you're engaged with other people, people are more likely to say, you're not looking so good. I mean, actually, you're looking fine. But I mean, people are more likely to say, you're not looking so good, you ought to see a doctor, or more likely than others to give you feedback about your health. Or if you slip in a bathtub and break a leg, and you go to church regularly, someone will notice. But if you don't, no one will notice. You're likely to lie there a longer time. So there are real health effects. Yes, it's really important for you to bowl. Or be civically engaged in some way. So it matters. What I'm really trying to say is this. It matters in some quite concrete, measurable ways. Our lives together are hampered by the fact that we're no longer connected. It's not just nostalgia and warm fuzzies. Really, real problems are affected, are increased, complicated by the absence of social capital. So it matters. How did it happen? I'm not entirely sure that I know all the reasons as to why it happened, and I'm eager to get your questions and get your ideas about why it might have happened. The first reason I think that's relevant, my daughter, of whom I'm extremely proud and is a graduate student at the University of Michigan, tells me I have to be careful in how I phrase this point. But the movement of women into the paid labor force, that is the rise of two-career families, is an important part of this story. One way of looking at it is this. Over the course of the last generation, we've taken a third of all adults in America off the task of producing social capital. That's just my jargon for taking the kids to the Little League. And we put them on a different set of tasks in the law office or the classroom or at the Walmart checkout desk or whatever. And nobody's doing those tasks anymore. It's pretty clear from the time budget studies that men don't basically pick up the tasks, and at least half the people in the room knew that already. I didn't need to say that. Our mothers were doing a lot that was socially productive, but it wasn't part of the GNP. And so the fact that we've stopped doing that, no one quite noticed. But it had real effects. That's what I'm really trying to say. So I'm certainly, I want to be very clear about this. I'm not saying that my daughter ought to drop out of graduate school. I'm extremely proud of her. But somebody's got to do those tasks that used to be done, that social connections that our mothers were doing. So that's part of the explanation. I thought for a long time that part of the explanation was that we were moving around a lot more. I thought that we were like plants, you know, when you repot them. Each time you repot a plant, the roots get broken off a little bit, and it takes time to put roots in a new place. But it turns out, well, part of that story is true. Moving around a lot does reduce your civic engagement, does lower your social connectedness. But we're not, as far as I can tell so far, actually moving around more than our parents did. Actually, the number of us who live in a new home in any given year, that is, the number of us who have moved in any given year, is about the same, a little less, actually, than it was in the 1950s. Now, I'm not completely sure I understand all of that story. It may be that we're moving longer distances, and it may be that longer distances are more disruptive of social capital. Maybe when you move from Palo Alto to Cambridge or vice versa, that's more disruptive than moving just across the street. So there may be something to this mobility theory that I haven't yet discovered, but so far I haven't found any good evidence for that. Another important change that's going on that is relevant here is technology. Technology is privatizing our leisure time. We're spending, because of technological change, more of our leisure time alone. I don't mean privatizing in the sense of public ownership or private ownership. I mean in the sense of we're being private. The best example of this, of course, is television. Television has had a huge effect on our time budgets. It's the two things I've mentioned, namely women into the labor force and television, are the only things that have had any effect at all, visible effect, on the average American's time budget over the last 50 years. But they have had really big effects. But it's not only television, it's many different. For example, the average number of hours that the average American spends listening to music each week is rising. We're listening to more music. But the number of hours spent listening to music in the company of another person is declining. Right? We're listening to more music, but we're listening with CDs or Walkman. And if you ask why that's true, why are we adopting this more private technology, the answer is we can get exactly what we want now with technology. I mean, for example, I happen to be a fan of classical music. I confess I'm not particularly fond of 20th century classical music. So if Rosemary and I go to the BSO, I've got to sit through the Hindemith until we get to the good stuff. Whereas if I sit home and listen on the CD or the Walkman, I can overdose on Beethoven and Brahms all day long. Now, I have a friend, we used to go to the concert, the symphony with them. He actually likes this modern stuff, and he finds the 19th century stuff saccharine. So he stays home and listens to, I suppose, Hindemith on his CD. And that's fine, we're both happier. I mean, I like the Brahms and he likes the Hindemith, but we don't see each other anymore. Technology is enabling us to drive a wedge between our private tastes and our public connectedness, social connectedness. And this is probably part of a much longer time change from village dances, I don't know, to vaudeville, to movies, to television, to VCRs, to virtual reality machines, in which we'll put a visor in front of our face and be really happy, because it'll be really interesting information and entertainment, but totally alone. So technology in a fundamental sense is privatizing our leisure time and making us more passive too, not teaching us not to interact with one another. Well, there may be other reasons. I was interested to see that George Will thinks that my story is approximately right, but he thinks there's a different explanation for why we're not connected with one another. He thinks it's the welfare state. And no, I'm not kidding about this. Gingrich said apropos of my article, well, the reason people aren't going to PTAs is because of government bureaucrats. They're there, and if the government bureaucrats would just go home, the people would come to PTAs. I don't want to be quite as dismissive of that idea as perhaps I just now sounded, because it may be, there certainly are times when government has destroyed social capital. A not bad summary of the urban redevelopment programs of the 1960s was that those programs renovated physical capital and destroyed social capital. So I think that it is possible for government policies to destroy social capital, but I don't, at least at the moment, think that that's a very important part of the explanation for the change that I've talked about. I want to say one more thing about the characteristics of social capital. I've talked about social capital this evening as if it were a single thing. We could have more of it or less of it, and I think in part that's true. But there's one feature of social capital that is worth paying special attention to, and that's whether it is what you might call bridging social capital, that is social capital that cuts across the other cleavages in our society, or social capital that's not bridging, that's within only a single community. I think this is important because I think that the most important problem in our country, bar none, is how little social capital we have that crosses the racial lines in our society. The downward trends in social capital have affected all parts of American society. These trends are down among women and down among men, down among whites and down among blacks, down in the suburbs and down in the Midwest and down in the central city. We're all suffering from less social capital, but we're especially suffering from the absence of social capital that cuts across these cleavages in our society. That poses some really serious moral, ethical dilemmas to which I do not have a good answer, but I want to simply alert you to the importance of this question. If I had a magic wand that could create more bridging social capital, I'd use it in a flash. And probably anybody in here would use that. If we had a way we could think of to create more social capital that cut across racial lines in the country, and class lines and so on, we would use it. But suppose we had a magic wand that wasn't quite so magic. It did create more social capital, but not bridging social capital. It got more whites to go to church and more blacks to go to church, but not to go to the same church. Would you use it? Now, people of my generation, people who came of age during the Civil Rights Revolution, for the most part are very, and probably all of us, are very uneasy about that question, because we know in our hearts as well as our minds how important bridging, that is, integration is. And I believe that. But I also think that we've got to think hard about this connection of social capital within our communities. I think we've got to look hard to find some tools for creating bridging social capital, but I also think we've got to be alert to ways in which we can increase social capital, whether or not it bridges. I recognize that that's a complicated ethical question, and I'd welcome, one reason I mentioned it is to welcome some discussion about that point. Well, I know this has been a downer. I've talked about some serious problems that I think are facing our country that affect everything from our lives to our lives in community. I actually know what can be done about this, but I've talked too long, so I want to thank you for your greeting.
Thank you, Bob. I want to tell you a little more about Bob at this point so that you know he's in the neighborhood, part of the social capital of the Kennedy School and Harvard, because Bob is working on a book titled, coincidentally, Bowling Alone. And I know that he's receptive to questions and comments and help. And any of you in the room that might have some ideas, some insights, pass them along to Bob. He's the director of the Center for International Affairs, so he's right up the block. And we move now to someone else who is right around the block, and this is Reverend Charles Stith. Many of you know him as an organizer and a religious leader in the Boston community, known now nationwide. He's the director of the Organization for a New Equality. For many years, he was a pastor at Methodist Church here in Boston, and is now devoting his time full-time to the Organization for a New Equality. ONE provides opportunities for economic and cultural empowerment in inner cities and other areas. So what he'll bring to the discussion is the perspective of a practitioner who's trying to build social capital and may be able to give us some insights into how to solve some of the problems we've seen today. Thank you. Reverend Stith.
I am not, unlike Bob, I'm not going to suggest that I have some answers to some very complicated questions, but I do want to zero in on some questions and use this as an opportunity to take advantage of all of this brain power gathered in this room. So I'm going to be very short, very brief in my response, because I want to hear from you, and then plus Bob took all of my time. Let me offer first three observations that I think are relevant to this issue of diminishing social capital, or the way we've talked about it in the past, the climate of incivility that exists in the country right now. And then I want to raise the question that I kind of want us to spend a little time talking about. I think there are three things that probably ought to be added to your list or looked at a little bit in trying to appreciate why we've begun to experience this diminution of social capital. One, I would encourage you to revisit the mobility issue, because while the rate might not be significantly different in terms of how we're moving, by virtue of the fact that we are a much larger country now in terms of population, I think that the sheer volume, I think, is a contributing factor to the zeitgeist of the period as it relates to diminishing social capital. And then the other point that you made mention of, Bob, in terms of the distance between families in particular, and I can appreciate it in a very personal way. I have a household in which my mother-in-law lives, and she is a great friend, and I never tell any of the mother-in-law jokes because she's a great friend. But it's interesting, I had a conversation with my mother the other day, who lives in St. Louis, which is where I'm from. And one of the things that she was lamenting was the fact that she is not as close to family as she would like to be because of the kind of support that provides. So I think this mobility issue, there's a little something to it, and it's worth revisiting. Secondly, and this is relevant to this issue of technology, I would suggest that it is not just our attachment to technology, which has resulted in a kind of privatization of our leisure, which has contributed to the diminishment of social capital, but it is also the messages conveyed via technology. I happen to sleep with one of the foremost authorities on violence in the country, Dr. Deborah Prothero Stith. And that's right, I cleaned that up quick. And in her book, Deadly Consequences, one of the things that she talks about that I think is particularly relevant, not only to this climate of violence that we see in the country, but to this issue of diminishing social capital, is the kind of unfriendly world syndrome that is conveyed through the media. We get more news more often than ever before. And as we know, the axiom which drives news coverage is, it's not good news that sells. While most respectable journalists decry the notion of if it bleeds, it leads. The reality is that most of the messages that are conveyed through the media about the kind of world we live in is that this world is an unfriendly place. The third point that I think is relevant to this climate of incivility and diminishing social capital, which is where I really plug into this debate or discussion or concern, and it has to do with the political dynamic which really defines where we are now as a country. That politically we see ourselves more as a nation of competing interest rather than a people with a common interest. Now, having offered those observations, let me raise my question, but give it a little context. As David mentioned, I am now the president of the Organization for a New Equality, which has as its primary purpose the economic empowerment of women and minorities. And we set that out as an agenda for us because we saw that as the next vista in terms of continuing the civil rights movement. Just as the civil rights movement was able to work in this country because we were able to fashion a consensus which cut across color, class, community, gender, and generation lines, I am absolutely convinced that the only way we will be able to move forward with an agenda of economic empowerment, inclusion, and opportunity is if we are able to fashion the same sort of consensus. And right now, America is more divided, or at least as divided along lines of race as it has been at any point in our history. The National Conference of Christians and Jews did a study in 1994 which corroborated that point of fact. And one of the things that I have begun to talk about as I move around this country is that next year, 1996, we will be marking 100 years since Plessy versus Ferguson. That doctrine espoused by the court of separate but equal. And as you all know, we got the separate part real right. We came up real short on the equal side. When we look at the fact that last year, both at the congressional level and in state houses around this country, we were dealing with a crime bill with 3 strikes and you're out. Just last week, my governor signed welfare legislation, 2 years, welfare reform, he called it. 2 years and you're out, or I call it the 2 strikes and you're out legislation. And we look at the fact that in California, there's a so-called civil rights initiative that with all probability make it to the ballot, wherein this issue of affirmative action will be put to referendum. And I think one could certainly make a case that, you know, you've got 3 strikes, you're out, 2 strikes, you're out. The end of affirmative action means you're not even in the ball game. That this issue of diminishing social capital and how we can begin to do the kind of bridge work, Bob, because I do not believe it is in the best interest of the country if we raise social capital in the white community and we raise it in the black community and there is no common pool of capital which provides what we need to flourish as a society. So the question is that, for me, you know, what do we do to replenish the supply of social capital that will enable this country to come together again around color, class, community, gender, and generation lines so that we can make America work for everybody? Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Stith, by the way, is completing a book called Political Religion, so maybe we'll have you, another view of you here this fall when the book comes out. And when that happens, I'll try and plug my new book as well, so maybe we can look at all 3. We'll turn now to questions from you, and I know that many of you have read the book. Here's how we'll work this. We have 2 microphones on the first floor. Please come to a microphone, tell us who you are, tell us where you're from, ask a question, don't make a statement, and we'll try and answer as best we can.
My name is Gabriela Ramos, and I'm here at the Master in Public Administration. I'm not a U.S. citizen, I'm from Mexico, so maybe my question is more general because I think we share some of the problems about getting people together into same interests and objectives. But I was thinking more in terms of alternatives to the systems that we now live in. It seems that since we claim that the capitalism system and democracy is the triumphant system after the fall of the Soviet Union, it seems that there are not real alternatives that we think about of. And it seems that also the young population that were like the ones that were proposing changes and were proposing ideals have lost this kind of impetus. So maybe it's because we have become more pragmatic and tried to find ourselves in the world the way it is. Maybe because there is no real alternative to talk about it, or just because we have to accommodate ourselves. So I don't know what is the relationship between this lack of alternatives to the lack of social capital.
Well, let me try first, and then Reverend Stith can comment. I think it's a very good question. And I agree with the premise of your question that the issue of social capital is not one that's unique to the United States. It may be that these trends that I described, the downward trends in social capital, are more marked here than in other countries. I don't happen to know Mexico well enough to have a good sense of whether I think social capital is declining in Mexico, but I know it is in a number of countries. I said in my remarks, I want to comment primarily about the U.S., however, though I'll respond to your question with respect to the U.S. I said in my remarks that these trends were down in virtually every category within the United States, down among blacks and down among whites and down among women and down among men and down among northerners and southerners and so on. There's one exception to that. The trends are down at different rates for different age groups. The trends are hardly down at all in the United States for older people. Older means older than me. That's what older always means. So among older people in their 50s and 60s are holding up, and 70s are holding up the average, because they're not down very much at all compared to people who were their age 30 years ago. The trends are down more among people in their 40s, are down a lot more among people in their 30s, and they're way down, way down among people in their 20s, comparing them not with today's current elders, but with people who were 20 years old 30 years ago. So what that says, 2 things. One is the trends, if we don't do something, the trends are going to get worse before they get better, because as a succession of generations leaves, it means that we're losing older people who are doing more than their share of the civic engagement, and they're being replaced by people who are doing less than their share of civic engagement. The second thing, however, that fact implies is that it implies if we could change the degree of civic engagement and social connectedness among the younger generations, we could have a pretty big effect, a disproportionately large effect on the overall problem. And I don't have any easy answers to that question. I think that part of it may be as you say, the absence of adequate ideals in this kind of post-history, post-Cold War world. But I don't actually think that that doesn't feel quite right to me. It doesn't feel to me that the problem is an absence of idealism among younger people. Of course, I mainly have contact with people here in this school and in this university, and we know that you're not typical. We know that you're unbelievably, students here, unbelievably more civically engaged than most people your generation. That's why you're here. So you're not typical, and I've got to keep reminding myself of that. But nevertheless, I think that there's a high degree of idealism. I think that what is more important is to somehow come to translate that into action. Because I've been talking not about what's in people's minds, I've been talking about what we do. Bowl or vote or talk with other people about politics or go to church or go into trade unions or whatever. And so I think it is important you may be right that the way to address that is to articulate a more attractive or more moving set of political ideals. But I think that in the end, it's not just a matter of ideas. I think in the end it involves you going out, I mean us, going out and becoming more engaged with one another. That's at least my impression. Reverend Stith, you're actively engaged in trying to solve the problem.
Yeah, I'd come at it from a slightly different vantage point. That I don't think that the diminution of social capital ought to be interpreted simply as a commentary on democracy and capitalism. One of the things, a couple of things that I've found that I feel rather interesting. One, for a nation like ours with its distinguished tradition of democracy, you know, we preach democracy around the world, we do a fairly poor job in this country of teaching people how democracy works and why it ought to work. I mean, in school, we don't do it anymore in our classrooms. And it would seem to me rather logical and rather obvious that one of the ways to get folks in this country, because I think you're right, Bob, if we begin with this generation coming up, we can have an impact, that one of the ways to get young people more invested and involved in the process of democracy is to teach them the values and virtues of a democratic society. The same thing exists relative to capitalism. One of the things that we've initiated through ONE in the African American community is a national campaign for economic literacy. And the reason that we've done it is because despite the fact that we extol the virtues of capitalism all around the world, we do a very poor job of teaching people in this country how this economy works and how to make it work for them. The other issue, and this is in keeping with this notion of grander ideals, the vision thing, is that we really do need clear and cogent political leadership. People who are willing to stand up and talk about the sense of division that exists in this society today and call people in this country to something higher than their own individual narrow self-interest.
Thank you. I'm going to keep my eyes on my watch. We will end promptly at 7:30 tonight, so we can all get home to watch ER. Although I recommend we watch them in groups. You're welcome to my apartment. I'll call my wife and let her know. I want to get through as many questions as we can, so ask a brief question. We'll try and answer quickly.
My name is Emily Fleshner. I'm a second year at the Kennedy School. And my question is that given that it's probably likely that women will have to stay in the workforce or would choose to stay in the workforce, whatever, and that people will probably continue to keep watching as much TV or more, would there be, or what role do you see for technology in the form of the information superhighway taking over some of this, or adding to the social capital, in that things like, well, all I've done is email, but all these other things that supposedly are out there. So it's not like you just listening to your CD player alone, you know, even though someone does email and this other stuff by themselves, you're at least communicating with other people. And so I'm just wondering what role you see that could play in replacing this.
Yes, that's a good question, and it's a complicated question because the effects of new technology like email are not going to be simple. But let me see if I can summarize briefly. I think the effects of electronic communication are to make our networks much wider geographically and much thinner sociologically and psychologically. Let me see if I can illustrate what I mean by that. This morning I at home signed onto the computer, as I do in the morning, and communicated with one friend I have in Germany and another friend I have in Japan. And I thought to myself, my father would be amazed at the thought that I have these two friends on the opposite sides of the world that I communicate with regularly. And then I looked at as I was going out of the house, saw the man across the street. I actually don't know his name. He's only been there 4 or 5 years. I'm sure eventually I will get to know him, and probably my wife knows him much better than I do. But I thought my father would be even more astonished at the idea that I didn't know the name. I mean, he would, not that only that I didn't know the name, but that I didn't know the uncle and the aunt and the dumb cousin and so on of the person across the street. That is, we have more social capital globally, and it probably does help world peace that I have these friends in Germany and Japan, but It doesn't help with respect to the risk of crime. What counts with respect to the risk of crime is place-based social capital. So the generalization I'm reaching for is that electronic mail does increase our networks in some important ways, but it doesn't necessarily, in fact, it probably detracts from place-based social capital, which is especially important. A last point, there have been some studies of the introduction of email into organizations, and the general rule is that when you introduce email in an organization, the efficiency of communication improves because you push one button and everybody gets the memo, so you don't have to worry about did you remember to tell somebody something. On the other hand, when you actually have a meeting in one of these new organizations, people get a lot angrier a lot quicker. And presumably the reason is that when you used to encounter one another around the water fountain, you talk and you say, how's your sister and is your mother feeling all right and so on. And that was, in a task sense, wasted time, inefficient, which is why we've introduced email. But in a sociological sense, it kind of created a cushion of connectedness and reciprocity and trust that make the organization, in some deeper sense, probably function better. So I use that to illustrate that I don't want to sound like a Luddite, perhaps I do. I think that there are some important things we can accomplish with email and electronic communications. I think we've got to be careful about, and you weren't doing this, but I think we have to be careful about seeing it as a panacea, because I think to some extent it may even exacerbate the problem. I actually do have the solution to the whole thing, but I'm saving it till later.
Thank you.
Hi, my question, my name's Matt Mayers, I'm an undergraduate. My question was, I guess, originally for Professor Putnam. I actually heard you speak last year when I was a freshman, and you talked about the decline of confidence in government and the two main reasons for it, and the first reason that you ended up with was this decline of social capital. But the second reason, which I also found convincing, was the decline of power of governments because of the role of international capital. And I'm wondering, don't you think that, you didn't really mention economics here at the Kennedy School, maybe it's sort of not done, but I wonder if that's connected to the decline of social capital in the sense of you have less civic involvement when you feel you have less power over it. When a plant closes down, it destroys the community. And connected to that, don't you think part of the reason there was such a move into the workforce of women was the economic pressures, the overworked American? It wasn't just, the women's rights movement. It was also the only way you could get a good household wage was if the women worked.
I think both those are good insights. I can't figure out exactly how to test the first proposition. I've paid a little, I've worried a little bit about it, as you indicated. Does the globalization of the economy in some way erode the material basis for community? It needn't be global. The emergence of Walmart and the disappearance of downtowns also has that same kind of effect. Indeed, the general move in our commercial life is toward more and more anonymous connections, even commercially, as we move from the neighborhood store to the mall to the e-mall, and the e-mall will be even more anonymous. And so, yes, I think you're probably right. I probably should make more of that. And I agree with you that there were important, no doubt about it, there were important economic motives for the change in the composition of the workforce. Although not only that, it began actually earlier, and the movement of women into the labor force has been more or less independent of, statistically speaking, independent of ups and downs of the economy. But I agree with you that economics matters.
Over here, thank you.
Hi, my name's Anna Donald. I'm a first-year MPP student. I guess I'm quite delighted by the paradigm that you've set using the notion of social capital, and at the same time a bit frustrated because it seems to me that a lot of what you're talking about is a lot of what women have traditionally known as nurturing type activities that we've all kind of known for a long time are very important, but which have been very much underrated and undervalued by the prevalent ideologies. And I'm just curious as to how you can see these values and these ideas as suddenly being incorporated by the prevalent ideologies when they have in fact been displaced and put down for so long.
That's a very good question. The easy answer would be that the others of us are just slow learners. It took us a longer time to understand the importance. Well, I think that, look, if I can just be autobiographical for just a minute, I have been stunned. I'm just an ordinary teacher, so I've been stunned at how much attention there's been paid to this argument in public in the last month or so. And I've spent a little bit of time trying to figure out why are people paying attention to it. And here's what I think. I think that, and I am going to actually try to answer your question about what the role of nurturing and connectedness in our personal lives. I think for most of us of my generation and maybe a little younger, the reason that the response has been so strong is that people my generation, a little younger, know personally that our parents were more connected than we are. We know that our parents played bridge every week or every other week, and we don't. And they know that they did volunteering, and we don't, and so on. So that in a deeply, and we feel a little guilty about it, and we feel frustrated about it, and yet life is complicated and busy, and so we don't. And I think that the reason that people have responded so strongly to this talk about bowling alone is because it corresponds to what they know in their personal lives, and that tells me people really care about it. I don't think. And I've been very careful in talking about it. I'm sure I didn't talk this evening, and I don't, because I don't believe that what's going on here is some kind of moral selfishness. I don't think it's that we are somehow become more, more Gary Cooper-like, more. I don't mean Gary Cooper is selfish. Gosh, that would be a mistake to say that. I mean, I don't mean we're not more just more splendid individuals. We don't quite of like it that we're not connected. But it's hard to fix this by yourself. You can't go to a bowling league by yourself unless other people go. That's what it means to be a league. And that's a fundamental, deep fundamental point here. This problem of social capital is something that you can't produce entirely by yourself, but we've got to do it together. And so part of what I'm trying to do, and other people, obviously there are a lot of other people talking about the loss of community in America, part of what we're trying to do is to say loudly, look, we all feel this way. Why don't we just get together more often? And I think a good way of saying what we're doing is we're calling attention, and some of us have known it for a long time and others of us haven't known it for so long, calling attention to the importance of nurturing. Thanks for your comment.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And every time I hear about negative trends in American civic culture, I have this nagging feeling that some hints about the causes could be gained from what I learned when I was in junior high or high school about the Roman Empire, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But I can't remember what I learned, except I think the only thing that stuck in my head was secret societies increasing and the prevalence of sex orgies and other things like that. I don't know if there are parallels between the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and
don't ask me.
Decline and fall. Well, no. I know your book was on the last few centuries in Italy. I'm wondering if either lessons from the Roman Empire or from other historical periods would help us get better explanations than the media mobilization, increased mobility, and the entry of women into the workforce, because all of those three factors strike me as things that one could make arguments, as have been made, that those factors could even help increase civic culture in many ways at the same time as they hurt in other ways. Increased mobility, more citizens moving into public life instead of staying home in their kitchens, and the media. I'm wondering if there are any historical examples that we can draw from to find out the causes.
Yeah, that's an extremely good question, and let me reflect a little bit on it, but without not exhaustively. First of all, as I look around the world in world history, I have to say that most of the examples of massive, rapid social capital creation involve religion, for better or worse. I'm a card-carrying ACLU and all that, so I don't want to. I think we have to be really careful about introducing religion into. We have to think about how we're introducing religion into public life, but the fact of the matter is religion is a really powerful creator of social capital, so that may be worth, and it's true in the history of the United States too, the periods where there have been rapid creations of social capital are like the Great Awakening in the first part of the 19th century. But then I want to come to the last example, the last part of the answer to your question about a historical example. Some of you know that I have been for some time, I was when I was dean here too, intrigued by the parallels between our time and the time exactly 100 years ago now. There had been a long period in the United States, there had been a long period of rapid economic and social change, the Industrial Revolution and the railway linking the country and the telegraph and so on. Rapid demographic change, massive waves of immigration, massive change of many sorts, inadequate political adjustment to those social changes, and a great sense of political dismay in the land about corruption and about inefficient government and about corrupt big business and so on. And a sense that you couldn't change, the system was just locked in, and a sense of declining connectedness too. And then all of a sudden, in a very brief period of time, roughly 10 years, the first decade of this century, in the progressive era, a massive number of political reforms were introduced that were really, at the time at least, amazingly productive. The first central bank in the U.S., the Budget Bureau, which allowed us to have a national economic policy, the first environmental legislation, the first consumer protection legislation, secret ballot, direct election of senators, and I could go on and on. The Progressive era was an amazing period, concentrated period of social reform and social capital creation. Settlement houses are a wonderful example of bridging social capital. That is, bringing people together to make connections across barriers in society. So I think, and let me give one last example in that period of how government was used to create social capital. My favorite example is the county agent system. The Department of Agriculture paid people to go around and build social capital. Now, some of us remember the county agents as the people who told our mothers how to can and told farmers what kinds of grain to grow. But what they, from the very beginning, at the end of the 19th century, what county agents were told to do and what they knew they were doing was building social capital, connections among people who were living in physical circumstances, farms, that were inhospitable to the creation of social capital. They were told to do that, and they did it. And most of the major social organizations of rural America come from that period. So we had a very effective public program for creating social capital in that historical period. Now, I'm not quite saying that I think we ought to have a county agent. Well, maybe I am saying we ought to have a county agent system for urban America. But I do think that that example illustrates that those people who say that that there's a kind of reverse Midas touch, that everything that government touches turns to dross, is wrong. I think the government can help communities build social capital and help families build social capital. So I think that looking at history, in particular our own history, is relevant.
Just a quickie. Again, I affirm the need to look at history, and rather than starting with the Roman Empire, I probably would be more inclined to start, about 100 years ago, because, while some of those progressive things were happening on one end, we also had the wholesale disenfranchisement of black people. Lynchings were at all-time highs. So there was an increase of social capital in one segment of America, but it was bankrupt in another segment of America. I guess a reference point for me, is in terms of what can we learn, and I probably need to think and pray about this a little bit more, because I don't want to over-romanticize it. But the period in the early 60s in this country was profound. I grew up in segregated St. Louis. There was a white side of town, and there was a black side of town, and how we related to each other was defined by law. With the 1960s, for the first time as a college student, white people came onto my radar screen. And it was in a way that was intimate. Buber talks about I, thou, I, it kind of relationships. Prior to the 60s, it was I, it. There was a kind of objectification of white people on my part, as there was an objectification of black people on the part of white folks. And in the 60s, something happened. And it's kind of summarized in the anthem of the Civil Rights Movement. When folks sung black and white together, it was not just a romantic notion out there, but it was something that folk really struggled to internalize. And I think that what we need to try to refocus on is what about that notion made it so attractive that we took a quantum leap as a society from where we were to where we landed.
We have time for just 2 more questions. So the rest of you that... Eric, and on back, you can ask questions afterwards. We'll stay up here to have as many as we can, but 2 more questions.
This is a question for the Reverend. What lessons can we learn from Ben Chavez's tenure at the United Church of Christ's Network for Environmental and Economic Responsibility, where he brought together, or he was able to bridge people together on an issue, the environment, which had traditionally been seen as a white and middle-class issue, and specifically lessons learned on message, mission, and goals?
Well, you know, I think in the question you really gave the answer, and that is that there are a number of opportunities in our present society that are natural points of common interest. And an issue like the environment is one of those. Regardless of how you start out feeling about somebody, we all have to inhabit this planet together. And it is in our best interest to do what we can do and need to do to make it a livable planet. I would also suggest that this issue of the economy and you know, represents a real point where there can be some common ground. In an op-ed piece that I did for the Globe a couple of weeks ago around this issue of affirmative action and initiative in California, one of the points that I made was that in a global marketplace where the rules are defined by things like GATT and NAFTA, our diversity really ought to be looked at as our strength. One of my members of the board, an African American, works for Coca-Cola. And during the anti-apartheid period, you know, when everybody was marching all over the country and all around the world, Coca-Cola, a lot of companies pulled out of South Africa. Well, since the election, everybody wants to go back into South Africa. And what Coca-Cola decided to do was to make this African American head of Coca-Cola South Africa. In that political environment, that positions Coca-Cola rather nicely. Now, it was definitely a good career move for my friend, Percy Wilson, who was the Institute of Politics Fellows, who I'm talking about. It was obviously a good career move for him, but it is also good for Coca-Cola in terms of enhancing its market share. And what is good for Coca-Cola is good for everybody who works for Coca-Cola. So my point is that, you know, around this economic thing, I mean, there are some ways to look at our diversity and our common interest as it relates to positioning us to play a leadership role that we need to focus on.
Thank you.
Before we go to the last question, I just want to thank the Forum Office, Heather, Marisa, thank all of the students in PAL 201, and thank you as an audience. You'll have the final question, we'll be through.
Thanks. My name is Kate Prusher, and I'm a senior at the college, and I have a question for Professor Putnam, which is, how viable do you think the issue of social capital is in mainstream political circles? And my example for this is the President's National Service Program. It's a program that certainly can be seen as effectively building bridges across racial and other barriers, but there's been a perception that it can't be sold on those grounds, that it has to be seen as something that's actually getting tangible things done, and its value is not inherently in bringing people together. And that's not only a concern about how Congress will perceive it, it's a concern about how the American people will see it. And I'm interested, practically speaking, in how your ideas have been perceived by people who are part of those circles, and I guess national service in particular. I also want to cheat and sort of throw another question into this, which is, could it be that we have redefined the notion of community in terms of our community really being our workplace? And I know you addressed the issue of email, but might it be more effective to try to build associations such as sports leagues or, you know, interest groups of sorts into the workplace than trying to recreate forms that were here before everyone's focus was on the workplace? Great.
Okay, I want to, if I might, do something that folks often do during debates. They answer another question. and I'm going to ask you to forgive me and beg your indulgence, because it was a point around this issue of women in the workforce and what that has meant to the diminishment of social capital. And this is biographical, autobiographical as well. And that is that the value of interconnectedness is important to affirm within the context of our families. My wife works very long hours and travels quite a bit, as do I. But one of the things that is important to making our family work is the fact that my mother-in-law this sense of extended family is a part of our household. And, you know, this kind of independence of spirit that is so much a part of American lore and the fabric of our culture is something that we need to re-examine and talk about people coming back together as families in order to give a greater increase to social capital. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. Actually, I agree with that is of the importance of family as a constituent of social capital. I am intrigued by your idea, Kate, about maybe we should focus more of our social capital creation on the workplace. I admit that in the past I've been somewhat skeptical about using workplace as a locus for social capital creation, because it seems to me that in the end, workplaces are subject to the logic of the market, and that isn't exactly the same as the logic of social capital. I don't mean by that social capital is some kind of airy-fairy thing. I mean that the benefits of social capital are likely not to flow directly to that firm, and therefore it's hard for the firm to invest in social capital, and therefore it's economically not so logical for a firm to spend a lot of time generating the kind of social capital that is so important in a broader civic context. So that's why I've been skeptical of it, to say nothing of the fact that firms tend to be structured vertically, and that's not so great for social capital. But your question has persuaded me that I've got to think more carefully about whether there are ways in which creatively we could use social capital generated in the workplace for broader community purposes. And I certainly think, this isn't quite what you asked me, I certainly think that one element of this strategy has got to be to encourage firms to be more flexible about work time and work pace and so on, as a way of trying to enable us to free time for activities that really are productive. It's just they're not privately productive, they're collectively productive. National service, well, what a wonderful question to ask, because I have actually just finished an op-ed piece that will be in the New York Times on this very subject sometime in the next week, I think, on social capital and the national service and AmeriCorps, because I think that it is a wonderful example of how government can, we didn't coordinate this beforehand. No. It's a wonderful example of how government can foster social capital in partnership with local communities. And that's what I try to say in this op-ed piece. I don't know, you know, the issue of the politics of social capital is an interesting one to me. My experience, you know, my vast experience the last month, in which I've been talking to political leaders about this concept. First of all, I've been astonished at how resonant as a concept it is. It's much more alive and lively to people than I thought that it might be. So a lot of politicians are interested in it, as they are in any topic that seems to arouse wide public interest. Secondly, there is broad political agreement on 2 points. One, social capital has been eroded. 2, that's not good. Everybody agrees on those 2 things. They disagree a lot about what to do about it. And I expect actually that we're on the front edge of an interesting, what I expect to be a fun, interesting debate about social capital creation in the United States. How do we, I don't want to make a big deal out of that word. Bill Bradley told me that I ought to can the word but keep the ideas, and maybe that's right. So I'm not pushing the word social capital, but the idea of worrying about civic engagement. We're going to have a debate about how to do that. I don't have any easy answers, but I do think that the debate will be in part about whether government is the problem or government is part of the solution. And I think that the Republicans it's not a crazy idea. It may even be right, actually, that government often destroys social capital more than it creates it. We've got to think about how to prevent that from happening if we care about making more of it. But in the end, and I am, you know, an unreconstructed liberal, so I think we've got to use public policy to try to help encourage the creation of social capital. But in the end, social capital is going to get created by lots of people around this country, one by one, from the grassroots. It's happening places. There are some success stories, and I think those success stories have got to be validated. So we can't, this is not a plea for a Department of Social Capital creation, and this is not a bid to be the first Secretary of Social Capital. Thank you all very much for your questions.